Hello, flight instructors and NAFI members. This is John Niehaus, Director of Program Development for the National Association of Flight Instructors. And I'm pleased, as always, to welcome you back to another episode of the NAFI More Right Rudder podcast, the podcast for flight instructors on the go. Now, today is a very special day. I actually have somebody who I'm really excited to talk to, and his name is Peter Zaccagnino. Now, Peter, he came to me, and I'm very honored for this because he has a passion for flight instruction and aviation safety. And I think you're really going to enjoy the stories that he has to tell. Now, a little bit about Peter, and I'll welcome him in just a moment. He has over 23,000 hours in over 270 aircraft. He is a test pilot. He's tested over 685 airplanes. And I know he's got some good stories about how some of them might not have even made it into production. He's done 17 years of aviation racing, and he's a four-time champ. He owns PC Aviators. He was inducted into the New Jersey Aviation Hall of Fame. He's also author and a aviation filmmaker. He's got two books. The newest one, New Cold War, is an award-winning book. And he was also the lead character on Discovery Channel's Dangerous Flights. Peter, thank you so much for carving out the time in your busy schedule for us.
Oh, my pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to our chat.
So it's a long list of some really cool things to talk about. And, I think where I want to start is talk to me about your instructional experience. Obviously you're a flight instructor, and, how did you get into that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still an active flight instructor, not just carrying the card in my wallet. But way back when in my undergrad, my undergrad was in aeronautical engineering. And instead of flipping burgers, I figured out if I hurried up and got some ratings, I would be able to start making some money and get some hours while I was doing my engineering degree. And so I got my commercial first without my instrument privileges. And that allowed me to start throwing people out of airplanes with a parachute on. And
Nice.
yeah, and I did that for quite a while, and that was a good door opener. And then when monies came in and it allowed me to, I got my CFI done, my first CFI, and that was a hell of a check ride, I got to tell you that. But my very first one, it was when the FAA took away the examining authority from all the pilot examiners, and only FAA inspectors could do it. And then they said that's not working, and they allowed like a handful of people to do it. And it was an 8.5 hour day of just CFI fun stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so was mine.
Yeah, I mean, just brutal, but good. It was fine, So then that led to starting to teach people, private pilots, while I was in my undergrad. And what ultimately really played out for me, I was given tailwheel checkouts in a Champ, and it literally paid for all but, let's just say 80% of my college was paid for through training people in the Champ. So I had a real love affair with the CFI and the tailwheel community because it got me out of school mostly debt free.
Wow. And that's an achievement for aviation.
You're not kidding. We all know it's expensive. I've always equated our career as similar to doctors, because you go to college, you get degrees, then you kind of do a residency while you build hours. Then people torture you in some other, misbegotten airplane. You get more hours in the right types of planes. And then finally you start making a nickel, and, it's a little tough, hats off to everybody. But I think the best thing about me as an instructor early on was just learning how people learned. And so I was a bit of a student as well. And when you really focus on transferring knowledge and skill to a person, in our example, aviation, you really learn a lot about yourself and your craft, as opposed to just, I'm here to build hours. And we know that happens, and it's unfortunate, but if we really pay attention to how to transfer knowledge to a student or an instrument student or multi-engine student, whatever the case may be, I think there's great value for the rest of your career in that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and on top of that, I've found that there's an additional sort of intrinsic value in just being able to use those skills in life. Being understanding that you can pass on knowledge in a certain way will benefit you in business and even with family in some cases.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I agree 100%. And, and I'm still teaching to this day. I mean, obviously I've flown a lot of planes and done a lot of different things in aviation, but I still, yeah, but let's be fair. I'm not doing it, 40 hours a day, 8 days a week, 400 days a year. But I'm still actively doing it in a bunch of different planes, and it's the same principles. It's just the planes are more involved and less forgiving. That's all.
Well, and it's refreshing to hear this, and this is one of the really cool things about having you on here is so often you hear the stereotype of people saying, "Well, you can't make a living in aviation education. You can't make a living as a flight instructor." And I think that scope is so misguided because it opens up the doors to a lot of things. And if you have a passion for teaching, it's just about what you do with it, and you can make a really good living and a successful living if you know how to leverage those skills.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And my path has been very circuitous. And just adding to your comment, John, which I agree 100% with, you know, I get almost annoyed when I hear people say, how you make a little money in aviation, you start out with a lot of money, that whole
Yeah.
joke.
Yep.
And I'm like, yeah, well, if it's that bad, go do something else. I mean, this is one of the best careers and industries in the world. I mean, I've been to every country in the world except for Madagascar, and it's
Oh my
completely
gosh.
because of aviation, not just going to these places, but experiencing them and not watching it on your favorite news network where they just show a smidgen of what's going on in Ethiopia. You get to see the whole thing
Hmm.
and smell it and get dirty about it, and it's all because of aviation, and it's been pretty good to me. I couldn't complain at all.
So one of the things I'm itching to talk to you about, and this is something that you mentioned when we first met, and that was that you obviously you have a lot of time as a test pilot, and
Hmm.
you've test flown a lot of airplanes. And
Hmm.
you mentioned that one of the sort of niche instructional areas that you kind of operate in is helping other people become test pilots. How did you get into that, and what's that like?
Well, my path definitely opened up because of being an aeronautical engineer and practicing engineer. I mean, just depends on which year we're talking about, how much I did engineering and et cetera, plus flying. But there's um, there's always pilots that have something that you don't have, knowledge, skill, whatever. I was brought in on some projects because I had a lot of HUD experience, heads up display. And those projects went very favorably. And then my role was also to share that knowledge and transfer it to other pilots on what I was looking for with the HUD, and not just the test cards we write, because we write these half-page test cards, right? And we make a deck of them, and then we go out and test the program with those deck of cards, and they get turned into a report, then gets reviewed at the safety review board, and that whole process, right? But in that role, every single time has been transferring that knowledge to other test pilots. Now, in some cases, it was just it wasn't other test pilots; it was pilots, because we're writing the rules on how this plane should be operated and how the equipment should be operated, and et cetera. And that takes a team of people to do. But then there was cases where we were brought in to teach test pilots, and that's a different animal, but it's still a CFI,
Yeah.
and we're trying to keep them on a different perspective, because the knowledge we're transferring to them is how to mitigate risk. None of us can eliminate risk, but we can mitigate risk. And so we're trying to teach them how to mitigate risk while getting the information and the data point they need for the test at hand, whatever that test may be. It could be a new airplane or a different engine or something hanging off the wing. There's a slew of test programs that go on. So we're transferring the knowledge to them that, okay, you got to mitigate risk. Yes. You got to be disciplined in your write-ups and all of that, but you also are there to gather data and transfer that to the company or whatever, the flight test engineers, both, all of it, other test pilots, so mistakes are prevented or avoided. And that's a different process. It's a different animal.
Oh, I imagine. So for our audience, when you're talking about mitigating risk, are there things that uh, your standard pilot or standard CFI could take from your techniques in training test pilots of mitigating risk? How does an average pilot use those same skills?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I don't think I have a takeoff that occurs without briefing myself on that takeoff. Um, I don't jump into any plane, and I still fly a lot of small, simple airplanes and complex single engine planes and blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
Luckily, I still have the time to do that. And if I'm in a Cessna 172 and I'm taking off, and what does it take to turn that plane back around and land? It's kind of a hot topic right now.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't know it, you shouldn't try it. If you haven't done that with someone that has the skills to prevent a really bad thing from happening, even during practice, you shouldn't do it. And you need to be disciplined about your approach to doing it and how do you get that knowledge. We could do it in an hour. It wouldn't take long. You come out to Park City and start flying a Lear with us, John, and I'll show you how to do all kinds of fun stuff with the various planes. But it's because it's a build-up process. We're not just out going and trying it.
Mm-hmm.
We're doing a build-up process to make it happen. And even in as simple of a plane as a 172, and it may only take an hour to do it in a 172 to get that knowledge, as opposed to a single engine fighter jet that may take several flights to figure that answer out. But it's still the same process. It just happens faster. So as a result, on my takeoff roll and pre-takeoff checks in the 172, great. We do the checklist and they're good to do. But then I'm also going, okay, if the engine pops at 300 feet, I'm landing straight ahead with whatever it is, period. If it pops at X feet, I'm making the turnaround maneuver and landing on the taxiway, which is actually closer to me than the runway, the opposite runway, because of the turnaround procedure. It's not just a 180, right? And if it happens at 1,000 feet, et cetera. And I just go through that whole thing until I feel I'm at a minimum safe altitude, whatever that is for that plane on that day.
Mm-hmm.
Some planes, it could just be your ejection altitude. So you got that moment where you're from 300 feet to say 1,800 feet because you can't eject from there, and you just hope something bad doesn't happen, and hope's a really bad strategy.
Yeah.
But you still have a plan. If it pops at low altitude, keep the gear up, put it on some soft surface and fly it through the post crash, and keep flying it until you're out of that plane. But the other thing is how we teach engine failures. I'm a big fan of ABC,
Mm-hmm.
airspeed, and trim for it. If you're at cruise speed in a Cessna 172 and the engine quits, how many turns of that trim wheel from top to bottom does it take to get you close to your 60 or 65 knot, depending on the model, best glide speed, right? And that's something that should be ingrained in everyone. It's not going to be a perfect trim, but it's going to get you close.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be a big determining factor, because now you're involved with the event as opposed to an observer of the event. And so it's not just airspeed best glide, it's trimming it to maintain close to best glide. You don't want to focus on it, but you want to get there and be close to it. And then B in the ABC is best suitable landing site and a plan for getting there. Not, the classic, there's the field, I'm landing there. Okay, good job, Johnny. Let's keep going. Woohoo, that was awesome. Nah, that doesn't really cut it. It's what's my plan? Well, if I'm at 1,000 feet, I can make a 360-degree turn, basically a modified pattern to land there in this particular plane. If I'm at 500 feet, I can only make, a 90-degree turn. That's it. And if you're at, 750 feet, I can make a 180, right? And you should know those numbers for the plane. So I think those are very important numbers to glean on any plane you fly. Piper Cub, MiG 17, it doesn't matter what it is, you should know that. MiG 21 is 23,000 feet. Good luck. That's roughly the altitude you need to make a 180. But you should know that for any plane you're in. And then C is the checklist, right? A checklist, perform it from memory, your immediate action items, small plane world, carb heat on, if it's appropriate, of course, mixture, change the mixture, either lean it or enriching it, depending on your situation, et cetera, and run through those memory item checklists. And that's the stuff we do on sometimes a more involved level, but it's still the basic stuff. Again, if it's a cool pointy airplane or a Piper Cub, doesn't matter.
It's interesting. You said a couple of things that really hit home with me. The first was basically vigilance, right? Because I think a good instructor always briefs the how to do a takeoff brief and includes all of the important items of what do you do and stuff like that. But to your point, so often it's going through the motions. You do it a couple
Yeah.
times, and then at the fourth flight of the day, and maybe the student is also on their second flight of the day, and you're talking about things, and you say, okay, this is what I'm going to do, blah 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 blah. But you can tell that they're saying the words, but they're not visualizing the words. They're not actually
Right.
paying attention to the words that they're saying. So to your point, the vigilance of making sure that you're going through these steps in an active way to understand what's going to happen if you actually have to do those things. So I
Yeah.
think
I mean,
that's
I
what.
think you're speaking to a super important point, because that 32.65 hour student pilot, he's just doing our first level of learning, which is rote, right?
Mhm.
And our job is to get them to the next level understanding, and the next level application, and the next level correlation. And when he gets to that final level, smart people wrote those things a long time ago before the world got really dumb. And, um, you know, for good reasons. And our job is to get them through those 4 steps. Because right now, like you just said, yeah, he's just going through the takeoff briefing because he knows he's supposed to, and
Mhm.
that's his rote. And we've all been guilty of it. None of us are perfect pilots. We're all causing trouble all the time. But you
Well,
know,
and you've got both sides of it. You've got the side where they're doing it because they know they're supposed to, and then you've got the other side that has done it a million times and nothing bad's ever happened, and so they're just saying it and going, it's fine, it'll be fine. And then all
yeah,
of a sudden something happens and they go, well, I briefed it, but I can't remember what I'm supposed to do.
yeah. I mean, the truth is, engine failures don't happen that often, but contaminated fuel does. Bird strikes for jets do happen.
Yep.
Fuel lines coming off and causing a partial engine failure, something that's not taught a lot. Swallow a valve on cylinder number 3, and you now have 3 cylinders working like they should, but the plane's still making some power. That's a whole different scenario.
Mhm.
A lot of that type of stuff. It's not like the private pilot should be 850 hours of flight training, but there's things to glean from other experience that can be transferred to that student.
Yeah, yeah. And the other thing I really like that you said was the idea of being an active participant, not an observer. Essentially, fly the airplane, right?
Yep.
When we are going for type ratings and things like that, I am typed on the Lear, and they always tell you fly it all the way to the scene of the incident. And I believe you said that as well.
Yep.
But it's something that is good to say, but it's hard to practice sometimes. People get resignation, or they just forget what they're doing because they're stressed out about what's happening.
Sure. And
So
you
I
can't.
really like that point,
Yeah, and the other thing is we can't practice crashing.
except in the sim.
Yeah, I guess that's true. But even then, even in the sims, you can't. You kind of can simulate a belly landing, but it's not the same. Like intentionally belly landing a jet. That's
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah.
I mean, the sims are awesome. I'm very pro training and pro sim, but they still, unfortunately, we got to rely on ourselves at those critical moments, and come back to those fundamentals that have been ingrained in us.
So as a test pilot, I mean, that's got to be pretty stressful. I mean, how do you train out the fear in in an airplane you've never flown before and doesn't even have the airworthiness certificate to go into production? Like, how do you
Sure.
how do you get over that stress level?
Well, it's definitely not for everybody, but I think when I think about the people that I've learned a lot from, very esteemed test pilots. None of them are thrill seekers. None of them are the excited type. It's just about we're doing a job, and our job is cool. And I think, at least for me, when we're building up to the first flight on an airplane, whether it's a experimental, amateur built experimental Lancair, for example, um, or it's a X plane being built for some group or agency, um, there's a buildup to it, an inspection process, safety review boards, weather, time of day, so many variables, and the professional is involved in that buildup because they're gaining confidence in the equipment. These planes aren't romantic. We romance aviation, but the planes aren't romantic.
Hmm.
You're not taking them to dinner and a movie, right?
Right.
And nothing wrong with romancing our career, but the planes aren't romantic. They're not romantic entities, and it has to prove to me that it's not trying to kill me, and that's the buildup. And that means engine testing, taxi testing, high-speed testing, liftoff testing, rotational tests. Some of those are pretty sketchy, and the plane hasn't technically flown. Well, it depends who you ask. Some people feel rotational tests it's flown because it supported itself in the air, even if it's 3 feet off the ground. But
Hmm.
and that's fine. I get why it's a hazardous test. But so those that build up method and that procedure gives you confidence in the machine, and then finally you commit to the flight, and hopefully you have a good team supporting that decision, both on maintenance as well as decision making. The more complicated test programs have a massive team, but when you're dealing with a amateur built Lancair, that there's still a team involved, and then the process is still the same. It's been simplified because of cost reasons, of course,
Hmm.
and but it's still the same thing. And so your confidence that I guess replaces the stress or the fear is in that build up process. To answer your question.
Sure. So what happens as a test pilot? What kinds of things happen that make you go, this one's not going to pass? We're not putting this one into certification.
Well, even if it's not for certification, because that doesn't really happen anymore in general. If a manufacturer is coming up with a plane to go to certification or for the military, chances are that's happening. I mean, really good chances. The ones that are less or have a more difficult time are the prototypes, and they're not a modification, they're a prototype. And there's been, not recently, but over the years, there's been a lot of startup companies with a new plane. I mean, kind of right now with the electric planes, there's a lot of electric planes popping up that have been designed on a computer and, haven't been flown. And we get these phone calls and they're quite fun to chat with. But yeah, we just spoke to someone a couple months ago back in the summer, and they said plane's been fully designed on a computer. You're gonna have it flying in September. And I was like, ooh, that's ambitious. But because of the build-up process can take months. But so there have been prototypes we've walked away from, and they were hard. Only twice for me. The planes never flew. They never flew when I walked away from them. We wrote up their deficiencies. One was so deficient that I didn't think it would ever be correctable. Not even with an infinite budget, you'd have to change so many things. There was a third plane actually, and it recently flew, not by us, flew by someone else. And we wrote up about, I did an inspection on that one, and I wrote up about 85 deficiencies.
Oh my gosh.
And I handed them the report, and I was the bad guy because I wrote up all these deficiencies, and I was like, hey, some of these, oh, that's right, all 85, you have to fix, or someone's gonna have a really bad day. And they actually flew it, and everything was safe and sound, and I think they did a lot of those fixes. But you feel like the bad guy because of how they didn't want to hear me tell them that their pride and joy with millions of dollars into it isn't going to fly under its current condition.
Sure. Sure. Well, I mean, if you don't tell them, I'm sure the FAA probably would at some point when.
Well, the FAA has a different role, and this plane is a prototype. The most recent one I'm speaking about, it was a prototype, and getting an airworthiness just so we can go fly around the pattern as an experimental.
Oh,
It's not that hard. Um, it's hard in the sense of it takes a lot of time and energy, but it's not that hard from the paperwork side. And and only one person could be in the plane unless it was a two-person aircraft. In this case, it wasn't. But they did get it in the air and it was safely back in the ground. It's done subsequent flights. I don't think it's done much more than that, but
hmm.
you know.
So, to shift gears, I know
Yeah.
one of your sort of passions is aviation safety. And I know that you do a lot of speaking on aviation safety. What kind of topics do you like to talk about, and especially if it's related to aviation training?
Um, that's a part of it. I think I have a little bit of different approach to it than maybe some of the industry.
Hmm.
Definitely have overlap, right? With the industry, but I'm big on training. If you go to school for Lear 45 in Atlanta or Tucson, you get your type rating, you're legal to go show up and fly that plane. Is that a good idea? Maybe. I mean, it depends on the person, right? And their experience. And yeah, they've flown a lot of Bombardier products and they know their language, so to speak, of that manufacturer. And, maybe it is a good idea. But that's an honesty thing. And I got a lot of type ratings and flown a lot of different jets. And I would still rather fly with someone that's flown that jet before me going out and doing it alone. It's
Hmm.
just smart, right? And so I kind of use that example to answer your question because um, a friend of mine, Mike, he was helping me get this vampire ready for racing, and it was the same thing. I was like, if he has done it before me, and I can get some good information from him, and not the bad information I was receiving prior to him, why wouldn't I? And it's just a smart thing to do. And sure, there's planes that are super easy to fly, and you could just jump in and go, and I get that. But anytime you can get 10 minutes in that plane with someone else, I think it just immediately reduces the risk level,
Hmm.
even if it's a very simple airplane and the nuances of that simplicity. And so that's kind of one of my tenets is to just suggest people get the training, whether it's, again, 10 minutes or 10 hours or whatever makes sense for that equipment type. And you know yourself, it's a bad feeling when you're up there wondering, did I switch the right fuel tank correctly? Did I do the,
Right.
and you're like, I really don't know. Oh, well, the manual and the checklist says so, but is that really understanding? Which level of learning is that, right? That's called the scared panic learning.
Yeah, let's wait 5 minutes and see what happens.
Yeah. Um, but then it's all, in my opinion, it's really knowing your machine and not just doing paperwork to know your machine. There's a place for paperwork, of course, but safety isn't through paperwork.
Hmm.
Safety is through knowing the equipment, knowing yourself, knowing the conditions. One of our pilots and myself the other day were just spending probably too much time figuring out the conditions on our runway because it was a lot of snow and they plowed it and et cetera, et cetera. And we just evaluated it extensively, and he's a very experienced jet guy. And we came up with a decision, and the decision worked. But it was the same thing. It was, I don't care how much I've done, how many times I've landed in Arctic conditions and Greenland and here and there and blah, blah, blah. It was still just, let's evaluate this time because this time is different from every other time. And we just took the time to do it. And we're not afraid to tell our customers, no, we're not doing that. And one of the best lines I ever had flying a Gulfstream, I had this great customer. He said, weather was bad. Gulfstream's super capable plane. He goes, Pete, we're not doing brain surgery. I don't need to go. And I said to him, I said, Dominic, even if you were a brain surgeon, if we just got there dead, what good of it would it be to go? Right.
Right.
I mean, it doesn't matter what you're doing. It doesn't help anything if the flight has a negative outcome. Right. And so we have great customers that respect our decision making, you know, and the fallacy of, well, it worked that time, now we can do it this time. Yeah, that's a dangerous path to be on. So yeah, that's one of the other points I like to share with people.
Even if you're number two and it worked for the guy right in front of you, it doesn't mean it's going to work
Yep,
for you. You have no idea
exactly.
what their capabilities or their airplane's going to do. I had a similar situation last week, actually. We had launched for Indianapolis Executive Airport. It's a 5,500-foot strip just
Mhm.
outside of Indy. And the weather wasn't good, but it was legal for us to go, and it was down to minimums. And it was supposed to rain, but it wasn't supposed to rain until several hours after we were going to get there. And we were launching from Florida. And so we get up to the Indianapolis area, and all of a sudden we realize the rain came early. And so, of course, I'm running numbers to find out, because I know I have to have anti-ice on because it's cold up here. Can wet numbers work? And they don't. And I'm trying to run a bunch of different scenarios in the course of just a few minutes, because we're nearly on top of the airport now. Can I make this work? And finally, you know, to your point, I had to stop and look at my first officer, and I said, you know what? This is stupid. And he looks at me and he's like, why? I said, we are nearly at the end of our duty day. It's at night. It's cold. It's rainy. It's, all of these things. And you and I are here debating whether we think that the pavement's going to be wet when we get there. It's
Right.
raining. It's
Yeah.
wet. The numbers say no. Forget it. We're not doing this.
Right.
And the hardest part sometimes is just convincing your own brain to go, why am I even debating about this? It's not worth it. Like you said, if I get the passenger where we want to go, but we, kill ourselves in the process, they're not going to be happy, assuming they even survive.
Yeah.
And of course, it's never easy to tell the passengers that there's a change of plans, but they get over it and they live to tell another day.
Yep.
But the peer pressure is real.
Yeah. And, the duty day is there for good reasons, but there's things like you just mentioned that affect that. But I think the biggest takeaway from your story is that you just transferred an experience to your co-pilot that he can pull out of his tool bag sometime down the road. And, the runway is 5,500 feet and the charts say you can land in 5,450. And some people say, well, a professional pilot's going to make that work out, and et cetera. And I'm like, okay, but there's variables that affect that. And do you want to be that close on your margins? Sometimes, yes. I mean, sometimes the answer is yes. And that is the difference with a professional. And you answer that question. But then there's times because it's late in the day or it's, things that are adding up and stacking up. Even though it's all legal, it still might be the better answer to go land at Indy International and skip
Mhm.
executive and, have a simpler day of it because of the decision-making process.
Well, and unlike you, I'm not a test pilot, and so certain numbers are performed to the test pilot capabilities, and us regular guys need to remember that am I going to hit those numbers perfectly? Maybe once out of every few, but I'm not going to hit exactly what you guys might have on perfect conditions.
Yeah, no,
On a good day.
yeah, and even when we were using average pilot technique, which is part of criterion for certification, you have to delay your response time. Doesn't matter. It's still we're ready for the task as opposed to it just gets thrown into your lap. I
Mhm.
get it. I get it. It's not about being Superman anyway.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's obviously this is jet talk, but you could to relate this back to sort of the piston aircraft. I mean, the same thing goes. If you're getting braking action reports and you're not comfortable with that, if you are going into a short grass strip and you're not sure about performance numbers and things like that. I mean, all of this stuff does translate regardless of what size.
Absolutely. Yep.
Not only do you have to know the airplane's capabilities, but you got to be honest with your own. The airplane
Yep.
can do it. Can you?
Yep. Exactly.
So it's one of my more passionate topics, because I just feel like you said, people feel like they need to be Superman. They need to
Yeah.
be Tom Cruise in Top Gun, or Han Solo and whatever.
Sure.
So it's just it's interesting to get people to recognize what they're capable of doing, and to be honest, when they're in over their heads.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, absolutely.
So racing, how did you get into racing?
Well, long time ago, galaxy far away, I was called and asked if I would fly the pace plane in the sport class at the air races in Reno. And I was like, sure, haven't done that before. Let's go. And I was using a Lancair, and I showed up, and I'm getting all this briefing and really great guys, great friends to this day, Rick and Jeff and others. And we run around doing the pace plane under their tutelage. And I was like, oh, yeah, I'm coming back next year. I'm racing. And so talked to another friend of mine, Bob, and we came up with this plan on resurrecting this Lancair 4. And we did. And I showed up the next year to start racing with that in the sport class. And I was hooked. And great guys. Again, back to training. These guys are great instructors because there's a whole process to being able to race. And then that was what, 2005, I think. And then fast forward several race planes later, getting into the jet class. Initially with an L-39 I was flying and using for flight test support, actually. And said, well, we got this L-39. Might as well go to the jet class because that looks really fun. And yeah, so 2007, I took my first championship in the first gold championship in the sport class with the Lancair.
And that was your first year, wasn't it?
No, in my first year, you may have seen on the internet and stuff, sometimes it gets confused. The first race I ever raced in, I won a heat race, but that was just a heat race. And it was cool. I have to say that the first race ever, I did win in that heat race, but that wasn't a championship.
Okay.
Yeah. And then so 2007 was my first championship, and that was in the Lancair. And then 13 with a highly modified L-29 with a big engine shoved in it.
Wow.
And then 2015 with the Vampire jet. And then 2019 with the L-29 again, after that got allowed to race again through the approval process. And yeah, here we are.
So I'm not familiar. What is a Vampire jet?
So the Vampire is a really cool airplane. We speak about generational aircraft, generation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I call it a generation 0.5.
Oh gosh.
It was, so most people think it was the original engine in the Vampire. They often incorrectly say it's a Rolls-Royce engine. It's not. It's actually a whittled de Havilland engine made by de Havilland, ultimately became a Rolls-Royce engine, the Neen, through iterations, but it was actually a de Havilland made engine. And I mean, this thing, you could throw walnut shells in and it would operate it, pretty simple, but the wing was awesome. Really fast wing. It was a simple plane, but it had some complexities. It had some really unique stuff. I mean, there was no percent of power. It was RPMs of the engine, literally 10,000 RPMs or whatever the number was. And very different. It was pretty cool to fly a jet of that vintage. And it was the first aircraft to go to a carrier, in fact.
Really?
Yeah. Later in its career, it was the first jet fighter to cross the Atlantic. Yeah, it's a pretty unique plane. They built a lot of them too, and sold them to, Australia, Switzerland, and all the typical and common places that buy from the manufacturers. But it's got twin boom tail, single engine. This particular one had two seats, two side-by-side seats, and something's dinging. Sorry about that. And but it was a neat plane to fly. It had its things that were challenging because a lot of the people that knew how to keep it flying, they're gone.
Yeah.
It's that old. So a lot of things we reinvented the wheel, and there's just not that many of them, but it's a cool airplane. So like I said, it's technically a generation 1 fighter. I called it the 0.5, generation 0.5.
So you said you had a couple of good mentors for getting in, but how does somebody make that leap? How do you learn to be an air racer?
Excuse me. Um, it's a couple things. You have to go through. I'll start that over for editing. Sorry, a little bit dry here. Um, you have to pass what we call pylon racing school, and nickname is rookie school, and that's in June, right around Father's Day. And I kind of have always said it's more like pylon racing testing. And what I mean by that is when you show up, you're expected to have good skills about several areas. One of them is fundamental, upsets and basic aerobatics, as it relates to racing. You're expected to be very strong in formation and your formation skills. And then your aircraft. There's people that have showed up that didn't know their airplanes and they have not passed. And they were very experienced pilots. One particular I think of, it was a F-16 pilot. Good guy, good pilot, but he didn't know the plane, and you're not going to pass that course without knowing the plane. He came back and he did fine. But the training component is about the racing, getting on the track, how we do our procedures, the race start, the race exit, the recovery. Those areas you are taught, and it's quite involved. There's a massive, what we call the mass in brief. Then you have the class briefings. You have briefings before each flight, and then you have a ramp briefing before you actually get in the plane. And you debrief that and talk about issues, and then you pre-brief other things. I wish I would stop doing that. And so the briefing process is pretty involved because of good reasons. The race course is from 50 feet roughly to 250 feet off the ground, and it has a corridor that you're in. You can't go inside the pylons, and you can't go outside the limits of the race course. So it's a pretty narrow environment, and you're doing this at high speed with 8 airplanes. So the training requirements are pretty, I think, extensive, and the demands are pretty high, and as they should. And we've had, guys and gals with less experience pass because they just worked really hard at it, and they've done a great job. And then there's been very experienced guys from the military who haven't passed, and every combination, of course, in between. And it's back to training. I'm an instructor there and a check airman, and I've learned from the guys before me and that are still doing it, and some have retired, but how to transfer the knowledge to a racer who's in most occasions already a pretty high experience and high pedigree pilot, but now we got to transfer the knowledge to them. So again, it's another CFI issue, so to speak, and learning what's going to get the information into their head so that they're a safe racer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. With all of this stuff, have you ever done or thought of doing like the Red Bull stuff or?
Yeah. A friend of mine that used to do it, he passed away, unfortunately. He was announcing for Red Bull. He was also flying in Red Bull. And the first time they stopped Red Bull, I was pursuing it. And I don't know if I would have gotten in or been invited or not. There's variables. But I was pursuing it, and then they stopped. And he frankly said to me, "It's cool, but boy, is it consuming of your time, and it's not this big payout." Okay. And we all have to make a living. Then I just kind of backed away from it. You can't do everything in your career. I've tried. I mean,
Yeah,
I
it sure
really
looks
do.
like you've tried.
But I did. I backed away from it, and then they stopped it again, of course, as we all know. I don't know if I was asked right now today if I would do it or not. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's always different when you're actually asked versus thinking about it figuratively. So, but it looks like fun.
It sure does. It sure
Yeah.
does. So with all these things that you've done, I'm sure you have more stories than we have time for, but do you have any cool stories, especially from an instructional side, that you'd like to share?
From the instructional side, boy, I have a lot of stories, but I want to try and think from the perspective of instruction. Well, there was one that was very interesting. This was early on in my career. Well, there was two that happened early on. I was checking a guy out in a tailwheel airplane, pretty high performance tailwheel airplane. He was doing great, and he is great, and he's a great pilot. Um, but things always happen. It's funny how things happen.
Hmm.
And we were touched down on this really nice grass field. It's now paved since then, but and our touchdown speed in that plane's about 80. So it's kind of quick enough. All of a sudden, I'm in the instructor seat, tandem aircraft. All of a sudden, I'm looking at the grass, and he had pushed way too much nose forward. Um, and I felt responsible in the sense that, you know, I was a little lax because he was doing so well, and it was a great lesson. And nothing happened, and that's why it was a great lesson. If something happened, it's never a good lesson. But
Hmm.
all of a sudden, I'm looking at the grass because he pushed forward too much on the wheel landing, and I grabbed the stick and copped the power, and off we went. And nothing bad happened. And I was like, "Dude, what happened?" And he's like, "I just pushed forward too much." I'm like, "No, that was what caused it, but what led up to that?" And it was a great discussion. It was just his own awareness of where he was at with the flight controls. But again, nothing happened. The other one that was interesting, I took. The other one that was interesting is I took a friend's sibling up for a flight, and she was taking lessons, and he was in aviation, and it was a flight, the classic case of she wasn't sure about her instructor and if he was good or not good, and that whole story. And you never know which side of it is, right? So we went up, and I was like, well, let's do some basic maneuvers, some of this, some of that. And I said, we'll do a stall, and let's do a benign stall. So power off, clean wing. All right, time to recover. And she stiff armed the yoke. So her both arms were locked
Ooh.
with the nose facing the ground. And she was frozen. She was absolutely frozen. And I yanked the power out, of course, to mitigate the scene. And then was like, okay, you need to stop doing this. And etc. And next thing I know, I was literally pushing down on her elbow at the joint so her arm would relax. And then she like came out of this whole moment, and I was like, "You okay over there?" Because we were aiming at the trees and water. She's like, "I don't know why I did that." So classic case. She had up until that point only seen demonstrations of stalls, and it was another classic example of the stall word making her think it was death and mayhem. And but yeah, so those are the first two that come to mind. There's been others.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. So as we start to wind down here, obviously we've got to mention the book.
Thank you.
First and foremost, New Cold War. What's it about, and where would I find it?
So the New Cold War, that's the second book in the series. We call it the Relevant series. And it's definitely a military spy thriller. It's not an aviation book. And the first book is called Relevant, and it's about a CIA developed asset that leads a team that's chasing bad guys. It was that book. The first book was more kinetic. The second book is more about the espionage side, but still with some kinetic operations. And then I use a lot of the narrative in the book between the characters um, to basically how would you put it? Bring out some historic facts, some metaphysics, asking the question and why do you do this? Why do you think this? Why do you feel this way? About hot international topics, and with the hope that, through a good story, maybe people will think a little bit about it other than just what's on the news,
Hmm.
and question things a little bit. Nothing crazy. Still a fun book to read. That's the point of it. Um, and the easiest way to find it is on Amazon. It's they've done such a good job on how they do it. It's definitely the easiest way to get the book.
Cool, and congratulations on the award.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate that, John.
So, I mean, any other projects or anything else you wanna plug or talk about?
No, I mean, we're always doing good, cool adventure chasing stuff. Uh, the third book's halfway done
Oh,
to,
wow.
to speak to that. And then I'm trying to get the flying book, which is not a part of the series, of course. Just my flying adventures. Anybody got any good ideas for the title? Let me know. But it's a lot about the places I've been, the people, and the food, and all those things that add up to positive experience. But I'm also putting in the bad experiences too. and
One of my favorite things about my job is the food.
Oh
We
yeah.
I joke that I've traveled the country for no other reason than to eat dinner, and it's if I actually took the time to write down all the places that are my favorite places across the country, I feel like I could sell it to Food Network or something because you're absolutely right. Oh my gosh, the food.
All right, so you see these notebooks right here?
Yeah.
You get to see them. I have like 40, I don't know, four of them. And I didn't start it right at the beginning, but in these notebooks, it has the flying basics for logging purposes and approaches and all that. But then what it also has is where I ate for a restaurant, where I stayed, comments on both, and if I met someone interesting or conversations and just whatever I want, it's kind of my notes. And so I'm going through those to get the stories that I want to highlight in the flying book.
Yeah. No, that sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Pilot's Guide to Eating America is what I've been thinking about. So
Well, there was the Pilot's Guide to Hamburgers, right?
yeah, yeah, but the scope is too limited.
I know. I get it.
So, well, Peter, I really appreciate you taking the time. I know scheduling's been a little bit tough, but your stories are amazing, and what you have done for just representing flight training and how it can be unique and special, and how people, like we said before, can make a living doing something that they love. It's a amazing thing, and I think it's a role model for all of us flight instructors.
Well, I hope so. We all have to give back at various chapters in our life and et cetera. So, anything I can share, just holler. If I can help you anyway, John, just let me know.
I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, no problem.
So there you have it, folks. Peter Zaganino, and make sure you look up his book. First one being Relevant. The second one is New Cold War. There should be more books coming out shortly. You can even find the former show he worked on, Dangerous Flights from Discovery Channel. And I'm sure there's going to be plenty more in the future. So thank you so much again.
You bet, John. We'll see you soon.